Hello and welcome everybody to the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. I'm pleased to host a book launch this afternoon and evening on a new volume edited by Corey Dyke called Women in Philosophy in 18th Century Germany. And so the format of the session will be as follows. First, we will have about an hour to an hour and 10 minutes of presentations by the editor Corey Dyke and 4 of the contributors, plus Corey himself on his own chapter. And then we plan to have a short break before a sort of open discussion, which can be either questions directed at specific panelists or at all of the presenters. So I'm going to hand over to Corey in a moment to sort of chair the first hour of the session. Corey, as I'm sure you know, is the author of many articles on Kant and particularly the early modern German context. He's the author of Kant and Rational Psychology with Oxford University Press from 2014. And the volume that we're launching tonight is the latest in a series of edited volumes that Corey has been involved with, including Kant and his German contemporaries, co-edited with Falk Wunderlich from 2018, and a series of translations, early modern German philosophy, 1690 to 1750, which came out in 2019. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Corey for the presentations.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Stephen and Karin and the KU Leuven Classical German Seminar for giving us a chance to bring the band back together, at least part of it, the contributors to this volume to celebrate this book launch, this new book. I'm very pleased to be here, and on behalf of I'm sure all of the panel, Reed, Anne, Stephanie, and Christiane, we're just happy to have a chance to lay out what we think is special about this book. So I guess I want to begin just with a little bit of some of my own background for how I came to the idea for this project, and just kind of the course of my thinking as it developed on the way to this project, because I think it might actually be fairly representative of maybe the position of many folks who are interested in the history of 18th century German philosophy. So I guess what inspired me to kind of get started with this project was all of the great scholarship that had been produced relating to the contributions of women to early modern philosophy in general. That's really been a renaissance over the last, I would say, probably 10, 15 years. And I had noticed that there had been a kind of decided focus on the British context, the French context, even the Dutch and the Italian context were getting a lot of treatment by some wonderful scholars. And I wondered what was up with the German context. And I looked through some of the standard histories of German philosophy that focus on the 18th century, many of which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, yielded fairly little in terms of any kind of substantive engagement with women's writing and thinking on philosophical topics in the period. And that actually, strangely, that formed an impression in me that maybe what's distinctive about the German context is that women didn't contribute too much to the history of 18th century German philosophy. And that was kind of an odd thing, an odd feature of the German context. And that my initial kind of thoughts in this direction were, well, that seems like a fact that needs to be explained. And that made me think about, for instance, what kind of special factors, cultural, social, political, might have contributed to this. And there's a number of things that come to mind. For instance, the political and social conservatism of the states in the Holy Roman Empire, the persistent religious divisions that might have the effect of reinforcing traditional religious roles, for instance, and between men and women, the hidebound character of German intellectual culture, especially in the first half of the 18th century, and the fact that philosophical debate remained largely confined to the university and was conducted among academics in Germany. These all seem like relevant things that one might take into account as reasons why, as an account why women contributed less to the history of German philosophy in the 18th century. But as I read further, did more research, and certainly read some of the research that's produced by the colleagues that are on the panel with me today, it became pretty clear to me that this is the wrong question to ask, and that the fault of this question really doesn't. The problem with this question doesn't lie in the history of philosophy in the period, but really with the historians that maybe we've come to rely on too much, and that in fact, while there are some, I think, specific obstacles to women's ability to participate in the intellectual culture in 18th century Germany, one main one, for instance, is the fact that that Latin, rather than the vernacular, was used as the language of philosophical debate and even instruction in universities for much longer than it was, for instance, in English-speaking world, in France, and in other places, meant that it effectively excluded women from being able to take part, at least with what was regarded as the highest level of intellectual discourse. But even in spite of this, it becomes clear when one looks at these figures and their writings that this doesn't entirely inhibit women from taking part in the discussion in this period. That key developments in the history of German philosophy that women contribute to key developments in the history of German philosophy in this period, that there's certain debates and there's certain issues that we just can't understand unless we assign an important role to women in their development. And that, I mean, women were doing important work as well in popularizing philosophical ideas, but also engaging with important philosophical ideas, not to mention exploring and transforming those philosophical ideas in ways that that were distinctive and innovative and often unintended by the framer of those ideas. And it also occurred to me that women are contributing on a wide variety of topics in the period, ranging from metaphysics and aesthetics, anthropology, moral and political philosophy, in addition to other topics like theory of education. It was really an impressive array of topics that women were contributing to. It became clear to me that it is in fact impossible to write a history of German philosophy in the 18th century with any pretension to accuracy or comprehensiveness that doesn't attend to and acknowledge and explore the contributions of women to the development of philosophy in this period. And so really that's the aim of this volume, is to showcase women's thus far widely overlooked contributions to the history of German philosophy in the 18th century. And just by way of a quick overview of the volume itself, it consists of 11 chapters, and in it, the contributions of 11 women are considered. There's 11 German women who are considered, but there's also an American woman, a French woman, and one Prussian man. So, you know, it really goes all across the board. But the division falls into 6 sections. The first considers women's contribution to the Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. The second section looks at women's contributions to the question of education. So the issue of education was close to the heart of many women for a long time, and the German context is no exception here. The third section looks at women's contributions to the great debates of the period, in particular the debate between the Leibnizians and the Newtonians, as well as the pantheism controversy. The fourth section looks at Kant, women's relation to Kant, particularly Maria von Hebert, and also the Kantian legacies, the way in which the Kantian legacy, I think, improved in many ways on how Kant approached the question of women and their moral status, and looks at von Hippel in particular on this question. And the fifth looks at issues relating to self-formation. So the way in which women were able to construct a persona, that they were able to construct an identity as an author, and the kind of challenges that are posed by this. And then the final section looks at some echoes, so ways in which German philosophy was appropriated and resonated later on in ways that were relevant to women. So I think that the panel that we've put together here is a pretty representative selection of the issues that are canvassed in the volume. I might just say one last word, which is on the cover of the book itself. I have to be careful with showing it because I got the ether around me here. But the cover depicts Maria von Herbert. There you go. Karin has the, doesn't have a strange background that's getting in the way. But the cover is a portrait, a newly discovered portrait of Maria von Herbert, who was well known as a correspondent of Kant. It was recently discovered by one of the contributors to the volume, Bernhard Ritter. It's in private hands of a collector, but they agreed generously to let us use it as a cover. So, I mean, the cover itself has a kind of scholarly value because I think most of us know the name of Maria von Herbert, but until now wouldn't have seen a portrait of her. Okay, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to the panelists. Our first one is Christiane Leduc, who will be taking us through his chapter. So take it away, Christiane.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. Thanks for this invitation. Scholars have long believed that Sophie of Hanover, on which my contribution is, never made really real contribution to the history of philosophy and ideas, and that she was mainly interested in political questions related to her family, particularly to the succession of the British throne. The most favorable interpretations concern her correspondence with Leibniz, which began in the mid-1680s and lasted until 1714, the year Sophie died. Indeed, Sophie and Leibniz discussed many philosophical problems in their letters and numerous meetings, especially the question of the immortality of the soul, the nature of thoughts and ideas, and some problems pertaining more directly to religious belief. However, most commentators have mainly focused on Leibniz's letters to Sophie and not on Sophie's letters to him. Some even seem to maintain that she did not help Leibniz clarify his ideas and that he might have explained his doctrines to any other person interested in the same questions. In other words, contrary to other famous correspondents in the history of early modern philosophy, such as Elizabeth of Bohemia and Antoine Arnauld, Sophie was mostly passive and did not challenge Leibniz on central topics. This would suggest that the philosophical position she held in her letters would likely be of little theoretical interest. Yet some commentators have tried to show that such views are incorrect and that Sophie actively contributed to her discussions with Leibniz, but also with other philosophers and theologians. Many testimonies prove that she was a discerning reader and that she tried to defend her own positions on some philosophical subjects. Unfortunately, Sophie did not write any texts or letters in which she lays out the details of her own views. There are also very few textual traces of her verbal exchanges with Leibniz and other philosophers. So the only sources that we have are these letters to Leibniz. Among these scholars, Lord Strickland has recently published a study on the philosophy of Sophie. In his opinion, Sophie held a materialist conception of the soul. Leibniz's idealist theory of simple substances or monads would not permit, according to Sophie, in Strickland's interpretation, to explain how and why the mind thinks. This interpretation was previously held by Fouché-de-Carrel in the 19th century. In my contribution to the volume, I believe that this claim, according to which Sophie has a materialistic conception of the soul, is misleading. It seems risky to conclude that Sophie is a materialist with respect to the nature of the mind. Her main focus is rather the problem of the interaction between the soul and the body. In my view, Sophie aims in her responses to Leibniz to defend a version of the doctrine of physical influence, and more broadly, to reject the hypothesis of pre-established harmony and other such metaphysical theories. To support such an interpretation, I examined 3 sets of letters in which the relationship between the soul and the body is addressed. Sophie first raises an example that seems to prove a mutual influence in the letter to Leibniz of 1691 that concerns the power of the mother's imagination can have on the child she carries. She heard a story saying that the mother would have influenced her daughter during pregnancy, and that would explain an early devotion to God. So her daughter's early devotion to God. Sophie seems to believe that her imagination could have an effect on the child's belief. This is not a novel idea for that period, as many tried to determine whether the imagination of the mother plays a role in the fetus's development, for instance, Malebranche. But contrary to Malebranche's occasionalism, Sophie appears to presuppose an interaction between the soul and the body. Considering subsequent letters to Leibniz, it also seems that Sophie does not approve of Leibniz's pre-established harmony because it forbids any soul-body causation. In the middle of the 1690s, Sophie and Leibniz resumed their meetings during which they discussed philosophical topics. Some important letters are dedicated to discussing the positions of Van Helmont in relation to the soul. Francis Mercury van Helmont is known at that period for maintaining a theory of the transmigration of souls. I cannot dwell here on the details of this theory, but I will focus on Sophie's reactions. She maintains at least two positions. First, contrary to Van Helmont's conception, she rejects the thesis according to which the soul might think when separated from the body, which is one aspect of his conception of the transmigration of the souls. A necessary condition for thinking is that the soul is endowed with sensory organs. This means, in this context, that the soul-body relationship is not only essential for explaining some specific phenomena, such as the power of imagination on mental and bodily determinations, but also for any account of mental states. Sophie's argument is mainly empirical and similar to what Locke claims in this essay at the same period. For Locke, experience teaches us that the mind's thoughts can produce motion and that the bodily motion has an effect on ideas. This view of experience is at odds with the idea that we have thoughts whose content is wholly independent of our experience, or at least of our sensory organs. The interaction between the soul and the bodily organs is therefore required for the mind to receive thoughts. At the same time, as was the case in Sophie's previous letters of 1691, our explanation of such a problem lacks completeness. This point is especially interesting in the context of the discussion of Van Helmont and Leibniz's theories of the soul-body relationship. Contrary to their positions, Sophie would claim that we can provide an answer, but not beyond certain limits, as she seems to have questioned Leibniz's metaphysical principles, as well as Van Helmont's principles. She casts doubt, for instance, on the ontological nature of unity that Leibniz attributes to substances. Between 1700 and 1702, there is a last series of very important letters for this topic, in which one could discern, as some commentators claim, Sophie's commitment to a kind of materialism. In this context, she reacts to the positions of Gerhard Wolter Molanus, who defends a form of metaphysical dualism in the manner of Descartes. She explicitly claims that our ideas must be material, and this is on the basis of such passages that Lloyd Strickland maintained that Sophie is a materialist. But contrary to a materialist reading of such passages, I think that Sophie focused once again on the empirical origin of our ideas. The focus is again on the necessity of sensory organs, not on the ontological nature of components involved in cognition. Some elements supports this interpretation, to my view. First, Sophie also holds that some ideas are immaterial, for example, the idea of the divine nature. Even though important kinds of cognitions rely on the transfer of material thoughts to the soul with the help of sensory organs, others could be considered as being independent of such source and thus immaterial. The question remains open whether the sensory organs are still used even in the conception of God. So there are still images of God, even if the idea of God is itself immaterial. But Sophie does not discuss this aspect in her letters. Second, Sophie never claims that the soul is material, only that it can contain material ideas. At most, it might be reasonable to say that the soul's ideas are material, but not that the soul is itself material. Also, it is not clear whether she is discussing here the images of material things or the corporal states that make these images possible. It thus seems inadequate to conclude that Sophie adopts a form of materialism or any kind of ontological principle. In response to Van Helmont, Leibniz, and Molanus, she systematically resists the idea of either approving or disapproving of them, and instead simply points out that our knowledge cannot grasp such principles. She admires their conceptions, but reminds them that several positions they support are confused and probably insufficiently grounded. Her empirical approach to the problems of psychology thus avoids certain ill-founded speculations and allow her to focus on phenomena specific to the soul-body relationship, such as the origin of sensations and the different functions of memory and relationship and imagination. Thank you.
Thanks, Christiane. So Christiane's chapter was on Sophie of Hanover and Leibniz. Staying with the Leibnizian Wolffian theme, we're going to go to Stephanie, who will be looking at telling us about her chapter on Johannes Unzer, who is important for the in her interpretation of the Wolffian philosophy specifically. So go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you. So the Frauenzimmer, I chose my chapter Frauenzimmer, I mean, the woman philosopher, is Johanne Charlotte Unzer, also referred to as Unzerin or Zieglerin, after her maiden name, according to the older German convention. She's a German writer, poet, and philosopher, as Corey said, from the Wolffian school. I had not been a specialist of woman philosophy before writing this article. I'm more in the Wolf, Kant, and German Enlightenment business, but I must say that as I began to work on Unzerin, I found the figure and the topic more and more fascinating for several reasons that I tried to lay out in my chapter and that I will try to summarize here. Stephen, could you just put the second slide? So first, so just 3 points. First, there is a historical interest, which is that Unzer so well, I think, illustrates the situation of women philosophers in this time period and the tremendous social obstacles that women faced in trying to write and publish philosophy. I don't know if it's a specific German phenomenon, as Corey suggested, but in any case, it's really shocking. Philosophy, in Unzer's case, it was even metaphysics, for, as I would also like to point out, Unzer was Germany's very first female metaphysician, composing in 1759 the first metaphysical treatise for women, the Grundriss einer Weltweisheit für das Frauenzimmer, outline of a philosophy for the lady. And second, the second point, the philosophical interest of Unzer. So what I would like to show now briefly is that she's not just a popular translator or mediator of Wolffian philosophy, but a philosopher in her own right. Representative of major Enlightenment tendencies, and in particular tendency toward the popularization, democratization, and feminization of philosophy, which in turn, third, may shed a light on some deeper stakes of women philosophy tout court. So I will take these 3 points one by one, beginning with some words on the historical context, the social obstacles to women philosophy, and Unzer's biography, since I believe that you may not know these things. So Unzer was born in Halle, the headquarters of Pietism, Wolffianism, anthropology, and aesthetics, and raised in a family of musicians. Her parents were Johann Gotthelf Ziegler, who was an organist at the Ulrichschurch and a student of Johann Sebastian Bach, and Anna Elisabetha Krüger. Educated in the Higher Daughters School in Halle, part of the famous educational institutions founded by the pietist August Hermann Francke, Unzer underwent a traditional female curriculum focusing on practical matters and religion. As she explains herself in one of her writings, her school did not offer her the opportunity to learn Latin, Greek, and foreign languages. Presumably, it did not offer any extensive learning of mathematics and the sciences either. And yet, thanks to her family connections, Unzer was deeply immersed in the Halle cultural and intellectual milieu and directly in touch with its innovators in aesthetics, poetry, anthropology, medicine, and natural philosophy. She was the niece of Johann Gottlieb Krüger, that you see below, a professor of philosophy and medicine, and she was married to the physician Johann August Unzer, who had studied medicine with her uncle and piano with her father, since this is such a small world. Besides her Grundriss, composed of a metaphysics and the natural philosophy, actually, Stephen, could you just put the next slide? So there's the Grundriss, which is a metaphysics and the natural philosophy. She also publishes several collections of poetry in the anacreontic style, such as the Versuch in Scherzgedichten, etc. You see the titles here. Unzer died in Altona, where she had moved in 1751 at the age of 57. I said women faced obstacles when trying to do philosophy. There is first of all the obstacle that philosophy was modeled upon a mathematical paradigm and that they were not allowed to learn mathematics. But then there is also the fact that the social conventions of her time imposed upon women a totally distinct set of honors or duties. And these difficulties are very well exemplified in the case of the Unzerin, and already reflected in the formal arrangement of the treatise that we are talking about here, the Grundriss einer Weltweisheit für das Frauenzimmer. You can really see that it was simply not possible to publish without male support, as shows here Uncle Krüger's dedication and long preface. You see here Herrn Johann Gottlob Krüger, he writes a dedication, a preface, in order to justify the inhabitable enterprise, as he says, and guarantee the moral virtue and truth expounded by his protege and niece. To show the latter's female modesty, Krüger insists that he had to wrest and even steal the manuscript from her hands, that he had to even use violence to make her publish it against her will. He adds that his intention is neither to disturb the public order nor to encourage women to neglect their domestic duties and invade the universities and lecture halls, becoming students and later on priests, lawyers, and doctors. So nothing of that is his intention. And Krüger enriches his niece's treatise by a great number of footnotes, illustrations, and diagrams in order to develop, clarify, and sum up Unzer's argument, gently correcting her whenever she goes astray, or to rebut real or imagined objections to Unzer's philosophical enterprise. So you see these two prefaces, and then in her own prefaces, the author, Unzer herself, joins her male mentor's argumentative line. In the preface of her Naturlehre, she curses her own temerity and male ambition, incompatible, she says, with the weakness of her sex. She here waives any pretension to philosophical originality and genuine authorship, and willfully endorses the role of her husband's student, confessing that she, from the very beginning, felt a certain indifference toward her own treatise. Originally, she had only intended to sum up her husband's letters, 4 very thick quarto volumes containing his translation and annotations on Baumgarten's Metaphysica, to make sure that she had understood them correctly and to give them a pleasant form. Later on, she seems to have decided to publish them so as to let her sisters benefit from this translation and more popular and pleasant clothing. But she says here, I cannot say that in the whole writing I've invented a single truth. My proper contribution does not reach further than the verbal clothing, Einkleidung, of the presentation and the choice of a few examples and ornaments. All these defenses and explanations speak for themselves and illustrate the dismaying obstacles to women philosophy that we may simply not be aware of anymore, at least I wasn't. So I will now turn to my second point, Unzer's philosophical interest. I mean, not only her historical interest, but her philosophical interest. Is there any? As just mentioned, she herself judges this contribution to be no more than ornamental, which seems to express a rather formal adherence to Wolffianism, or alternatively, a popular and didactic rather than a properly philosophical ambition. While maintaining the formal structure and division of logic and metaphysics in her 85 two-page long Grundriss, she at first sight seems to have abandoned the very core of Wolff's philosophical ambition, namely to provide an exhaustive systematization and mathematization of all branches of knowledge. Contrary to Wolff himself, Unzer seems reluctant to develop a philosophical discourse in the mathematical style, employing axioms, definitions, propositions. And it seems that it's not so much because she was not familiar with the mathematical forms of reasoning, but more as if she judged such a formal style unnecessary for exhibiting a systematic order. She does not retain the definitions from Wolffian philosophy, but throughout her treatise sums up the explanatory parts, replacing them with examples and various narratives. She also pays little attention to the most abstract parts, such as ontology and rational psychology, and in her preface to the second edition, she even expresses her regrets for having devoted too much space to metaphysics. Moreover, she makes clear her distrust of mathematicians, affirming that they, quote, are those serious people who always have lines and circles on their face, and the woman should not even bother trying to get to know them, as they are so sullen, mürrisch. Neither mathematics nor academic philosophy deserve any consequent effort on behalf of women philosophers. And, quote, it is enough that the most gloomy men worry their minds. It is natural to them, not to us. And in a similar vein, she says that causation is a matter for philosophers. Nonetheless, those philosophers who never stop asking why, just like small children do, who tend to acquire words without concepts, who engage in merely verbal academic disputes, etc., do not deserve the title of philosophers, but are mere scholars, Schulfüchse. They have lost their common sense or healthy understanding, gesunder Menschenverstand, and turn into distracted, mad, or morose hypochondriacs, Grillenfänger. So you see that she really criticizes this shallow academic philosophy, too mathematical, and relativizes this too narrow mathematical model for philosophy, and instead she introduces new alternatives. Stephen, could you just, she replaces the Wolffian mathematical and scientific notion of philosophy by a set of alternative notions. First, she suggests a return to the Greek origins of philosophy and to the Platonic conception of philosophy as a love of wisdom that seems to have fallen into oblivion in recent times. True philosophy, she says, cannot be mere mathematical wisdom grounded on a distinct and mathematical knowledge of first principles. Before becoming such a mathematical science, it must first and foremost be grounded in love, eros, in some attraction to a higher realm of things for their beauty, goodness, and true being. Such love of beauty is not a kind of infatuation. Unzer says she doesn't want to have verliebte Leserinnen, not verliebt sein. It is rather not something distracting the mental effort of attention, but rather the love of beauty and desire for good things, wisdom and happiness, which must lie at the very foundation of knowledge, wisdom, and philosophy. And for Unzer, such a nascent love of truth first takes the shape of a love of the world and of the soul's own beauty. Souls are not sleeping, but wakeful monads whose quest for knowledge is stirred by their contemplation of the world in its divine beauty. As Unzer puts it, souls are mirrors reflecting the beauties of the world edifice, enhancing and duplicating its beauty and its shine. This receptiveness for and love of beauty, accompanied by a particular curiosity for novelty and attention to details, is what conditions the methodical acquisition of an art of attention, developed in the path on logic and natural history. According to Unzer, natural history offers an art of observation and a catalogue, collecting and describing beautiful and wondrous objects. This is why she advises her female readers to establish their own collections, practice observation, and even experimentation in order to make their own discoveries and enhance their own faculties for invention. So the first notion would be philosophy as a love of wisdom, but according to the same Platonic intuition, philosophy is also the wisdom of one's ignorance. So we see that she elaborates on the Socratic ignorance and puts, I know that even after all my efforts, I do not know anything perfectly. And this diminishment of the mathematical model of philosophy seems in turn to attest of a clarification of priorities and the primary aims of philosophy, or world wisdom, Weltweisheit. Throughout the Grundriss, Unzer lays emphasis on the philosopher's practical orientation. She affirms that we learn wisdom in order to attain happiness and to communicate our own happiness to other humans. And this clearly recalls the Socratic model of philosophy, presenting Socrates as a model of wisdom living his philosophy in practice and as a citizen of the world, and bringing wisdom back from the heaven to the cities. So, and these insights also affect the question of style. From within Wolffianism, Unzer comes back to a Socratic conception of philosophy as an art of speech. As we mentioned earlier, she says that her own originality concerns a new verbal clothing and her witty style. She embellishes the treatise by introducing poems, illustrates also through stories, personal experiences. And these stylistic embellishments are intended for her. I mean, that's what I tried to show, were intended to offer far more than elocutio in the narrow sense of the term. Style is far more than a dressing up, merely applying enticing words. It is not a translation of truth in a popular form that could also be presented otherwise, not a pis-aller, a didactic and pleasant alternative and supplement to true philosophy. For the opposition between logic as an art of invention and communication and rhetoric as an art of persuasion that the early modern age inherited from Peter Reimarus no longer applies here in Wolffianism. There's no such thing as a naked truth, no content without form, no thinking without words, no method without style, or any truth is personal. Its comprehension only depends upon the speaker's ability to adapt and pursue his or her explanatory effort until reaching what he or she can suppose to be his or her audience's common and yet historical notions. In this logical and rhetorical framework, style acquires a philosophical and methodical value because it is what stirs and guides the reader's attention and thought. And these are Platonic ideas, I believe. So Unzer, I said, stands out in the title, stands out as a modern diotima, and yet they are also modern, founded on intrinsically modern premises, and in a sense, this Platonic reversal seems incipient in Wolff and Wolffianism itself. And these are aspects that I think, barely touch upon here. Actually, I prepared something a little bit longer because Corey said I could have 15 or 20 minutes, but I will just really now sum up this, I mean, how this Platonism and these notions of philosophy are nascent, present in Wolffianism itself. So because in a sense, Wolff himself already tends to relativize the importance of the mathematical model. In his view, even mathematics and logic are built on common notions that it receives from the first science ontology. So philosophy neither uses mathematics as a model, nor does it suppose any prior mathematical initiation. Instead, it possesses a dynamic, a collective, and an aesthetic dimension, aiming at the progressive clarification of common notions. And Wolff also sketches already a universal practical philosophy. And what I just want here to I just want to give one quote from maybe Stephen, if you could just put the next slide, from his from very interesting passages from his correspondence with Manteuffel that Corey actually indicated to me, and these are really very interesting thoughts on woman philosophy, which are already contained in Wolff. And I'm just going to read this one quote: "The human species will not attain happiness unless the female sex begins to philosophize, and unless it realizes that those ladies who are distinguished by their birth and by the qualities supplied by gentle nature must take the lead, since their illustrious example can make a greater impression in the mind of their fellows than the most well-grounded expressions of the most subtle philosophers." So this is from Wolff himself. And now to sum up, and these ideas are also perpetuated by his disciples in the 1740s, and in particular by Baumgarten and Georg Friedrich Meyer, a colleague and disciple of that Baumgarten and a close friend of the Unzer family. Stephen, could you just put the next slide? So yeah, I'm just going to quote this one passage from the journal, the weekly Der Mensch by Meyer. Actually, Meyer already includes thoughts on women philosophy in his journal Der Gesellige in 1748. So even before 1751, the year of the publication of Unzer's Grundriss, where he already explicitly formulates a wish that someone may compose a logic and metaphysics for the lady, suited both for women and the uneducated public, and presented in the style of aesthetics. And he takes up these ideas in this second weekly, Der Mensch, here where he says, one of the main purposes of this weekly is to save the dignity and majesty of female human beings, Menschinnen, and to put them in their proper light. So one could say that Unzer, in a way, directly responds to Meyer's invitation to compose a woman philosophy. And what is also striking is that she really pursues the aesthetic line. Her philosophy is all about traditional feminine topics, about love and falling in love, about contemplating and mirroring beauty, sentiment, art, poetry, the art of conversation and happiness. Otherwise put, in order to engage in the practice of philosophy, she plays the aesthetics card. So just very, very briefly, my third point on philosophical historiography, linking up with what Corey said in his introduction. I just thought that it could be interesting just to stir a discussion on these things, because I was struck by the fact that Unzer's primary concern, in a sense, is with the very concept or notion of philosophy, and that her book can be read as a commentary and as a criticism of the all too narrow mathematical and metaphysical or speculative notion of philosophy prevailing in her time. And that she's challenging this model, this all too mathematical model, and also in a way the model of the philosopher, of the lonely thinker, because she's really part of a collective project of a school philosophy. And I just thought that it could be worthwhile, in order to write a more inclusive history of philosophy, to set out with reflecting on the implicit notions and standards of philosophy or philosophers, because they are different and changing in time. Just think about these notions, which are not the same all the time. Philosophy has a history producing a plurality of philosophical projects, succeeding each other. And that's what I would like to conclude with. Take a step back, for philosophy is self-reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I hope it was not too long.
No, I was feeling generous when I said 20 minutes, but I knew you could make the most of it. So, so I'm up next, and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, there it is. I think that's it. Everybody can see that. So let's see. Here we are. So we've been looking at the relationship, the way in which women engage with the Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. And what I'm going to do in my chapter and in my presentation is look at Dorothea Christiane Erxleben, an important thinker in this period. And what I'm going to try and emphasize is actually her relevance for appreciating the other major pre-Kantian German philosophical school, namely the Thomasian philosophy. My chapter is entitled On Prejudice and the Limits to Learnedness. The main figure I discuss is Dorothea Christiane Erxleben. So her principal publication, and in my opinion, her philosophically most significant one, is the rigorous investigation of the causes that obstruct the female sex from study. The text contends for women's suitability for study and diagnoses a set of prejudices as responsible for their lack of access to education. And like other works that fit within the so-called Querelle des Femmes, Erxleben's text has traditionally been neglected in the history of philosophy. Now, the question about why this question, the so-called women question, which was a pan-European debate that went back to at least the 12th century. The question about whether this debate itself fits into the history of philosophy and where it does is itself an important question to ask. It's a debate that engaged women, but it's often kind of dismissed as not philosophical, as a quasi-literary dispute. In my chapter, what I try to do is also highlight the developments within the Querelle in this 17th and 18th century German context, but I won't focus on this here today. In this chapter, though, I contend for the philosophical interest of Erxleben's text. In particular, I claim that it deserves a place in our history of the period, not only for its argumentative rigor, but also for its strategic appropriation of and critical engagement with mainstream philosophical sources, and especially with the logic of Christian Thomasius. And as it turns out, Gideon Steening has just published an article in the journal Aufklärung that looks at the Wolfian sources for some of Erxleben's discussion. So that's another way in which she's engaging with this with the German tradition this time. But I'm just going to focus on the Thomasian context. But I'll begin with a brief bio of Erxleben before outlining my case for this. So here she is, Dorothea Christiane Erxleben. Her maiden name was Lepoen. She was born on November 13th, 1715 in Quedlinburg. She was the daughter of a medical doctor. She received an impressive private education and considerable medical training through her father. Her private education involved the rector of a local gymnasium who taught her Latin, but she also took lessons at home with her brother, her older brother, who her father was training for medical school as well. She made the most of it. In 1740, she received a rescript from the newly ascended Frederick II, permitting her to accompany her brother to Halle to study medicine. A variety of personal issues, however, conspired to prevent her from taking up her studies. Her first treatise, The Rigorous Investigation, was published in 1742, and it has a similar kind of origin story as the one that Stephanie outlined for Unzer's. Namely, her father, who writes a long introduction to it, explains how he found this set of papers in the drawer and insisted on publishing them because he saw their philosophical quality. He kind of chaperoned the text to publication. But this is all, of course, just a story that's told just to kind of make sure that the woman's authorship in this case and the practice of writing conforms with the then standard norms for what was the proper kind of activity for women to engage in. But after her father's death, she took up his practice in Quedlinburg, but a malicious complaint saw her required to take her medical doctorate to continue. And she did. She went to Halle. She defended her dissertation ultimately in 1754, and she became the first woman awarded a medical doctorate in Germany. She published her dissertation in the same year, and she published it in her own German translation. She actually wrote it in Latin and defended it in a long defense in Latin, but she published it in German in the same year. And it addresses an interesting question, kind of biomedical ethics, namely whether it's appropriate to recommend an easier course of cure over one that's harder and more likely to take more of a toll on the patient. But in any case, and there's some interesting things to say about the kind of way in which she engages with some of the medical literature of the period, which is also has kind of philosophical, takes up philosophical issues, but I'm going to focus on the rigorous investigation. So in terms of this text structure, it's divided into two essays of contrasting length. The first, much longer essay, diagnoses a set of prejudices that obstruct women's pursuit of study. And the second, shorter essay, considers grounds outside of these prejudices, such as laziness, greed, or jealousy on the part of male guardians, but also on the part of the women themselves that might hinder women from taking up study. The first essay on which I'll focus, and indeed I'll only focus on the first part of the first essay, exposes 4 prejudices. And here they are. The first is that learnedness is not suitable for the female sex, as they're not capable of accomplishing anything of value in it. Right? That they're not. Were they to take up learning, they wouldn't be able to do anything with it. The second holds the same on account of the fact that women have nothing that is useful to expect from it. That is to say, it conflicts with their traditional roles, that it would in fact distract them or deter them from undertaking them. The third prejudice holds that study is often abused by the female sex and occasions much harm to it, and so should be denied to it. And the fourth claims that women are better off without learnedness is because study among the female sex is a rare thing. And given this, she'd be seen by her peers as something foreign. And so a woman who seeks it would be taken to set herself above her peers. And so I guess set herself up for trouble in society. So I'm just going to focus on the first prejudice, which I think is probably the most interesting. At least Erxleben's discussion is the most interesting. So in rebutting it, she focuses on the contention that women cannot profit from study due to the alleged inferiority of the powers of their soul. So she's aware that some have claimed that women lack rational powers entirely, but in rebutting the former, she notes that she would rebut the latter as well. So I mean, this notion that women lack rational powers is obviously a silly thing to think, but it was in fact, there was people defending this notion. There was a theological dissertation published near the turn of the of the 17th century that bore the title that women are not human, and that part of the reason in which part of the basis for their argument in this case was that women, on the basis of scriptural sources, must be taken to lack rational powers. And this actually, Erxleben invokes this context at the outset of her essay, that this is clearly something that continues to be held by certain groups of people. But she doesn't want to address it directly. She thinks it's silly, and of course, the performance of her actually writing a philosophical text and publishing it would be enough to rebut it. But she also thinks that if she just shows that this claim about inferiority is a non-starter, then this further claim that women lack rational powers altogether is also silly. So she examines claims that women possess a weaker understanding than men, that they have a less effective will in governing their affections or inclinations, and that they have a less discerning judgment, and that these would all be reasons to think that they will not profit from study. So Erxleben takes each of these claims in turn. So with respect to the claim about a weak understanding, she points out, for instance, that preeminence in intellectual powers would be a ridiculous thing to insist on for access to study, since it would deny the opportunity of improvement to those most in need. And this includes women, but also men, right? So there's men, of course, who might not be taken to profit from education because they possess a weaker understanding than other instances, other individuals from their gender. Additionally, she distinguishes between the capacity for understanding and its use, claiming that women have a comparable faculty, but have thus far lacked the opportunities to apply it, which opportunities study would afford. She also claims that women, in respect to the claim that they have a less effective will, that women may be more subject to effects and so less susceptible to the rational direction of the will, but that this is because they have not been exposed to the techniques of discipline that are taught through study. And lastly, if women evidence a duller capacity for judgment, it is only because they are compared with men who have had the opportunity to develop theirs through study. Moreover, judgment is only useful when combined with other faculties like memory and intelligence, which are likewise cultivated through study. So she addresses these specific points, but then she, I think, diagnoses quite effectively a more general fallacy that lies behind many of these claims, that many of these prejudices that are intended to inhibit women's access to study. So she traces these various falsehoods to a single foundational fallacy, namely the inference from what might hold of women under current circumstances, that is to say, in their uneducated condition, in which they've not had access to study. So an inference from that to what pertains to the nature of the female sex as such. Thus she claims that whatever differences might obtain between the sexes that are cited as reasons to deny a woman access to education, these are in fact the effect of the lack of education and are only wrongly attributed to the nature of women. So she says in a rather striking passage, who denies that few women improve their intellects through study? Who denies that far fewer of the female than the male sex are raised for the burden of governing? Who denies that women are even more wicked than men? But that they are given to vice more than men from nature, that is what I call into question. So accordingly, she draws attention to the wrong-headed inference that proceeds from the fact that only a few women pursue studies to the conclusion that all women lack the requisite powers in sufficient measure to profit from it. So this is kind of the general scope of that first part of the first essay. And I think left at this, Erxleben's text would probably count as a noteworthy contribution, noteworthy for its rigor and for its kind of thoroughly modern character to the ongoing querelle. But it would perhaps be of little philosophical interest in its own right. Again, I think that's contestable, but one could see why there wouldn't be much reason to think about it in the kind of the broader history of 18th century German philosophy. But I think this would be to overlook the important context that's supplied by the logic of Christian Thomasius, on which Erxleben draws explicitly and with which I think she engages. Indeed, it's only when situated within this context that the most striking features of Erxleben's discussion become clear. And so the text in particular that she draws on, there's a couple, but the one that she doesn't cite, but I think that's important here, is the Introduction to Logic that Thomasius publishes in 1691. It was the first text in German that he published, and he published it, it was his first text he published when he got to Halle. And Thomasius, I should say, is not a bad guy here. He's actually a very sympathetic figure, and I think everything that Erxleben does with Thomasius's logic would be welcomed by Thomasius himself as a friendly amendment. So the subtitle of his Introduction to Logic indicates that he intends to outline a logic, which of course doesn't contain any syllogistics because he hates that, but that everything he's going to say is going to benefit all human beings, and he's explicit to say that it doesn't matter what estate or what gender that human being might be. And so Thomasius' intentions here are going to be quite in accordance with Erxleben's, that this is intended to be a logic that outlines a kind of a practical program for education that women as well as men should be able to pursue. So there's two things within the Thomasian context I think are pretty important for Erxleben. The first is his, what we can call his humanistic conception of learning. So he begins the Einleitung with this definition of learnedness, for which he uses the rather archaic term Gelassenheit. He says, learnedness is knowledge through which the human being is made capable of properly distinguishing the true from false, the good from the bad, and of providing the true, or as the occasion demands, the probable causes that ground it, in order that one might thereby promote the temporal and eternal well-being in the affairs of ordinary life of oneself and one's fellows. Right. So there's a number of things that are notable here. Right. This is the beginning of Thomasius's logic, his introduction to logic. And if you compare it with this aim with the aim, for instance, of Wolff's German logic, you would see an immediate contrast. Right. Thomasius isn't trying to provide us here with a handbook for scientific method through his logic. He's rather trying to provide us with effective and practical guidance for how we can tell the true from the false and the good from the bad. And that latter point is important as well, that Thomasius includes within his logic certain kind of strictly practical goals, how to be a better person, in addition to how to be better at recognizing what's true. And the second important part from the context of Thomasius's Einleitung is the analysis of prejudice that he turns to in chapter 13. And so here he has a fairly detailed discussion, and he identifies two principal prejudices that he takes to afflict the human understanding, namely the prejudice of authority and the prejudice of precipitant judging. And he thinks that he's got a kind of a fairly systematic way of thinking about these, right? That the prejudice of authority is based on an overweening confidence or love for others, and the prejudice of hastiness or precipitant judging is based on an overweening love for ourselves, right? So overweening love or admiration for our own cognitive powers. So he kind of takes these prejudices to be the result, this analysis of prejudice to be a result of a fairly systematic consideration of the ways in which we might go wrong. And there's an important connection between these two claims, because Thomasius thinks that the better we get, the closer we get to this, the attainment of learnedness, right, the less susceptible we will be to prejudice, because we're better at discerning the true from the false, right? So the idea is that we should undertake the prescriptions that Thomasius outlines in the logic, so that we can be free of prejudice and thereby attain to learnedness. So this connection is important because I think it's what Erxleben is trying to kind of question. So Erxleben, I think, takes up almost word for word Thomasius's discussion of learnedness, his definition of learnedness. So she uses the more modern term Gelehrsamkeit. She claims, like Thomasius, that it's a grounded knowledge of such necessary and useful truths, whereby the understanding and the will, and consequently true human happiness, are improved, right? So it's again humanistic in the way that Thomasius's was. And following Thomasius, Erxleben distinguishes two different aims of study, right? The first, where one seeks to furnish one's own understanding with useful truths and promote the improvement of the will. And the second, where what they call erudition is sought for the sake of, for instance, serving others in a professional capacity. So both Thomasius and Erxleben distinguish what they mean by Gelehrsamkeit from eruditio, from a kind of, Erxleben doesn't say anything negative about it, but Thomasius certainly does. He doesn't think that it's anything but a kind of scholarly or appearance of learnedness, and that it's not much help when it comes to the hard business of making decisions in real life. So borrowing this distinction from Thomasius, Erxleben claims that she's willing to concede that erudition might not be suitable for those with a weak understanding, both male and female. But she argues that the former, namely Gelehrsamkeit in this narrower sense, is readily attained by all. Right, so she's following Thomasius here and saying that yes, Gelehrsamkeit in this kind of broader humanistic sense is something that men and women can easily attain. It doesn't require any special study, it doesn't require you to know Latin or anything like this. It just requires you to be instructed in the ways that Thomasius outlines in the Einleitung. And indeed, this is something that Thomasius himself says in the Einleitung. That is, he doesn't make the connection that Erxleben does, but he says something that suggests it, namely that women are just as capable of learnedness as men. This is one of the conclusions of his first section. But so this is one of the ways in which Erxleben appropriates a part of Thomasius's views. But I think that she has a kind of a critical engagement with Thomasius on his analysis of prejudice. So with respect to Thomasius's doctrine of prejudice, Erxleben adopts a rather more critical posture. Like Thomasius, Erxleben recommends study as a means for combating prejudice, claiming that it serves to remove imperfections such as uncertainty, error, hastiness, inconstancy, doubt, or in a single word, everything that flows from a darkened intellect and corrupted will, right? So just like Thomasius, Erxleben takes study as a kind of antidote for prejudice. However, in departing from Thomasius, the prejudices that Erxleben discusses do not fit into Thomasian categories, nor does she attempt to draw such a connection to Thomasius's doctrine, right? Thomasius has a systematic division of prejudice, but Erxleben doesn't try to say, well, what the prejudices I'm talking about are, are due to authority or due to hastiness. They seem to be something separate that live outside of Thomasius's dichotomy. I think there's a reason for this, namely that Erxleben is attempting to draw attention to a crucial oversight in Thomasius's program. So while she accepts that the goal of study is the attainment of learnedness, and along with it, the removal of prejudice, she has, in the passages we've already considered, revealed a complex prejudice that works to obstruct women's access to education in the first place, making their attainment of learnedness impossible. And so in this way, she draws attention to a fundamental blindness among thinkers like Thomasius, who make the eradication of prejudice through study a priority, but fail to consider how prejudice can work to obstruct access to study altogether, right? What good does study do as an antidote to prejudice when prejudice obstructs you from gaining access to study? And even as illustrated through the learned men that Erxleben doesn't tire of citing throughout her text, it even seems to be the case that certain courses of study can actually reinforce prejudices, right? And so there's a kind of relation, there's an assumption of this kind of positive relationship between study and prejudice that Thomasius helps himself to, but he also doesn't consider the ways in which prejudice can obstruct an individual's access to that which is intended to cure prejudice itself. So to be viable then, such a program must make the identification and eradication of the sorts of prejudice that obstruct access to education a priority, before turning to the familiar prejudices like authority and hastiness and judgment that Thomasius talks about at the end of his treatise. Right, so I think that this is really an interesting critical point against Thomasius, right? So she not only appropriates the themes of his logic, well, let me just start this over again. So in her rigorous investigation, Erxleben appropriates themes of Thomasian logic, and in so doing foregrounds the emancipatory potential of his radical educational program, which, as already I've shown, Thomasius would no doubt have welcomed. But she also, in a critical mode, charges Thomasius, in spite of his intentions, with a crucial oversight that risks undermining the viability of his project for both men and women, right? So women are obviously affected insofar as prejudice inhibits them from study, but men are affected too, because if they're the reason why they're preventing women from studying or not actively promoting their access to study, well, then that's because they're victimized by prejudice as well, a kind of prejudice that isn't diagnosed at the end of Thomasius's logic. So I think this serves to earn Erxleben's text within the history of the Thomasian philosophy, which, as I've mentioned, and as you well know, is one of the key movements in 18th century German philosophy. But I think that what also distinguishes Erxleben text is its abiding and optimistic commitment to and invocation of the ideals of enlightenment, particularly the critique of prejudice. And I think this commitment to the Enlightenment ideals is revealed in the fact that Erxleben thinks that what's important here is to identify this as a prejudice, and that she has this kind of optimistic hope that once we've identified it as a prejudice, that the Enlightenment philosophers who've made full Urteil critique their kind of motto will have at that and try and undermine that prejudice and its malicious effects. Right, so her commitment to this ideal of enlightenment is evident through her optimism that once identified as a prejudice, the animus on the part of enlightened thinkers against prejudice in general will be leveraged against the pernicious prejudice that it inhibits women's education. So whether that optimism is borne out is of course a different question, but that's one to which you probably know the answer to, at least for the rest of the 18th century in Germany. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will turn over the word to Reed.
Is that displaying okay for everybody? Yeah, great. So thank you all for attending this book launch, and thank you very much to Corey for including me in this project, which I had a lot of fun working on. So my chapter deals with the figure Eliza Reimarus. We don't have any paintings, etc. of Reimarus. We do have is this silhouette. But I'll start off by saying a little bit about her biography. And what my chapter really focuses on is Reimarus's involvement in the kind of two major intellectual controversies of late 18th century Germany. in particular the fragment controversy, which is oftentimes understood as a theological controversy, and then the pantheism controversy, which is oftentimes understood more as a philosophical controversy, although I think that these things are on a spectrum. There's certainly a lot of philosophical elements to the fragment controversy and a lot of issues related to theological questions in the pantheism controversy as well. So Reimarus was born and lived in Hamburg. So she's born in 1735, and then she dies in 1805. And she was born into a prominent intellectual family. Her maternal grandfather was a prominent intellectual, and then her father is Hermann Samuel Reimarus, who in his own lifetime was a very well-known philosopher. Kant, for example, in the Third Critique, singles out one of Reimarus's books as sort of the state of the art when it comes to like mid-18th century physico-theological discussions. So he's an influential figure as a philosopher, as a philologist, also as a kind of early proponent of the study of animal behavior. And then her brother, J.A.H. Reimarus, was a very well-known physician and doctor in Hamburg. He helped bring smallpox inoculation to Hamburg. He also installed the first lightning rod in the German-speaking countries. And so she grows up, obviously, in a very, very, very intellectual milieu. And she indeed is educated by her father in languages like Greek and Latin, etc. In Hamburg, the Reimarus family runs a kind of early intellectual salon known as the Tea Table. And so this attracted a lot of major figures of the time period. So Lessing was a close associate of the family who attended the tea table. Mendelssohn was a close friend of the family as well. Jacobi visited them in Hamburg and came to the tea table. You also have figures like Klopstock, who were also members of the tea table. And then Reimarus's sister-in-law, Sophie Reimarus, was sort of the main leader of the tea table, although Eliza was also highly involved. And then Sophie's brother, August Hennings, was another figure who was very prominent in these circles. He was a very passionate proponent of Enlightenment thought. He himself wrote some works related to issues like toleration. And Reimarus herself had a very extensive and oftentimes quite candid correspondence with August Hennings. And so we learn a lot about her own personal views on different issues by looking at that correspondence. She was very active as a writer and translator. So she wrote a number of poems. One of the poems that she wrote was read at a memorial for Lessing shortly after Lessing's death. She was very close friends with Lessing towards the end of Lessing's life. She also translated a number of plays for the Hamburg stage. So these include things like Addison's Cato, Voltaire's Zaire. So these kind of standard Enlightenment era plays. She has a number of pedagogical writings, and indeed she was active at some points as a teacher and working well with children in a pedagogical sort of capacity. She also helped educate her brother's children. And so she has a number of writings that are related to pedagogy. And then she also has social and political philosophy. So there's a pamphlet that was published, Freedom. It was published anonymously, but she seems to have been the author of this pamphlet. There's another text from her Nachlass that deals extensively with political philosophy, provides a kind of outline of her political philosophy. And then there's some other kind of scattered things that deal with some social and political elements, social and political philosophy. And then she has a pretty extensive correspondence. So she corresponded with a lot of figures and including, as we'll see in a few minutes, people like Lessing and Mendelssohn and Jacobi and Hennings, but she has a pretty wide correspondence. She didn't tend to publish under her own name. She published primarily anonymously. I think one of her poems was published under her own name, but other than that, things were published anonymously or just with initials. But she wanted that kind of anonymity as an author. It seems. Okay, so then, like I said, the two controversies with which she is very intimately involved and that the chapter focuses on are the fragment controversy and then the pantheism controversy. So let me just say a little bit about these controversies and her involvement in them. So this is a picture of her father, Hermann Samuel Reimarus. Hermann Samuel Reimarus, during his lifetime, had a public image as a sort of member of a kind of moderate Enlightenment. So certainly a member of the German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, but somebody who it seemed was suggesting that reason was going to ultimately provide the foundations for religion, and indeed oftentimes seems to suggest that we need like philosophical proofs of the existence of God, etc., so that we can then believe that the Bible is revelation, because you have to believe that God exists before you can accept the Bible as revelation. But then in private, he was actually a very intense critic of revealed religion. And so he writes this manuscript, the Apology. And in this manuscript, he subjects the Bible to a lot of historical and philological criticism, argues there's a lot of incoherencies and contradictions, suggests that the apostles actually stole Jesus's body and faked the resurrection, etc. So obviously, you know, this writing wasn't the sort of thing that he was going to publish during his lifetime, but after his death, it was inherited by his family. And his family ultimately provided Lessing with a manuscript of this text. And so Lessing was working as the librarian in Wolfenbüttel, and he had a special permission to publish anything that he found in the library without having to go through the sort of standard censorship channels. And so he pretended like he had found this text in the library and published various fragments from it, along with some of his own commentary on those fragments. And Lessing's own views are not identical with those of Hermann Samuel Reimarus, but he uses the Reimarus text as a springboard for advancing some of his own ideas regarding religion and revelation, and more generally, the relationship between historical knowledge and knowledge of necessary truths. Okay, so how does Eliza fit into this? Eliza plays a very large role in providing Lessing with the manuscript. She and her brother are both involved, but it seems to be that Eliza really plays the more prominent role in providing Lessing with the manuscript. And it's not simply that she happens to have this manuscript and passes it on to Lessing, but somehow has no interest in these topics herself. Rather, it looks like she has a pretty clear position on these kinds of issues, a position which is quite similar to that of her father. So in a number of her public writings, I might say semi-public because they're anonymous, but nevertheless, they're being published. She, like her father, puts forward a number of arguments, in particular physico-theological arguments for the existence of a providential God, and also arguments for the immortality of the soul. And a number of these arguments are found in a text of hers, the Kinderphilosophie, which is part of some of her pedagogical writings. So she thinks that these kinds of conclusions can be demonstrated in a very straightforward and clear and convincing way that can be communicated easily even to children, right? And so in these writings, she talks about the arguments that she presented young children with to this effect. So her public image then is very much this kind of, once again, kind of moderate Enlightenment image of using philosophy to prove the existence of a providential God and immateriality, and thus perhaps immortality of the soul. But in private, and this comes out very clearly in her correspondence with Hennings, she's very dismissive of all notions of revelation. She's very dismissive of Christianity. She says that Christianity is false. And so again, her position seems to be then quite similar to her father's. Now I'll just note that I don't take these public and private positions to contradict one another that she adopts. She's just not making all of her views completely public. So I think she's sincerely committed to the rational arguments for a providential God and immateriality of the soul. But she's just very suspicious and dismissive of revelation in contrast to something like rational theology. In the fragment controversy, then, Reimarus is not simply, I suggest in the chapter, providing Lessing with the manuscript, but she's herself quite interested in these issues, and there's a lot of commentary in her correspondence with Hennings about how the fragments that Lessing's publishing are being received. She sort of rejoices that a lot of people are responding to aspects of the arguments in a way that she likes. And so she's certainly very much caught up in the issues. Okay, so then the pantheism controversy. So this controversy also revolves around Lessing. This one might be a little better known to philosophers in the room than the fragment controversy. But the pantheism controversy comes about after Lessing's death. So Jacobi famously claims that Lessing had confessed to him to having become a follower of Spinoza. And Jacobi initially reveals this information to Reimarus, to Eliza Reimarus, with the idea that she's going to pass it on to Mendelssohn, who is in the project of writing a kind of memorial to Lessing. And so when this information gets revealed to Mendelssohn, it then leads to a correspondence. And Reimarus is the intermediary between Jacobi and Mendelssohn in this correspondence. And so she's forwarding their letters on to one another. And indeed, in the correspondence, Eliza is herself given a very specific role. She's asked to sort of be the sort of judge between the combat that's taking place between Mendelssohn and Jacobi. And she adopts this role very willingly to sort of be a bit of an onlooker, but an onlooker who's making an assessment of who ultimately seems to be making the better case. So this correspondence turns into a kind of full-blown controversy when Jacobi publishes on the doctrine of Spinoza, which includes descriptions and parts of his correspondence with Mendelssohn and also with Reimarus. And so I have a quote on this slide. This is from Reimarus. She's writing to Mendelssohn. Without the least foreknowledge, I received through Claudius 2 bound little books, one for me and one for our doctor, that's her brother, under the title Über die Lehre des Spinoza und Briefe an Herrn Moses Mendelssohn, so on the doctrine of Spinoza and letters to Mr. Moses Mendelssohn. Already the mere sight of the title made my blood boil, right? So Jacobi has published this book with these descriptions of the correspondence, but without the permission of Mendelssohn and Reimarus. And so when she receives the book, she's immediately sort of like taken aback by the fact that Jacobi has done this. Now I'll note that even though she's initially taken back by Jacobi here, by the end of the day, she actually seems to side side with Jacobi in the pantheism controversy, and in particular regarding the question of the nature of Lessing's Spinozism. So there's a lot of issues that get caught up in the pantheism controversy, but on the kind of biographical issue of Lessing and the nature of Lessing's Spinozism, she ends up being sympathetic with Jacobi's interpretation. So she says at one point to Jacobi, your Lessing seems truer to me in some respects, and thus better pleases me. So as perhaps many of you know, once Jacobi publishes this book, it leads to this public feud with Mendelssohn and Jacobi, and it kind of culminates with Mendelssohn dying after, like, going out in poor weather to deliver a manuscript to the publisher. And Reimarus felt really responsible in many ways for Mendelssohn's death. And after Mendelssohn's death, she sort of retreated a little bit into the privacy of her family. Not entirely. I mean, she still is active in some ways, but has less of a public presence and is a bit more private after Mendelssohn's death, which affected her a great deal. So the issue philosophically that the chapter aims to engage with is trying to understand some of the actions and choices that Reimarus makes in the context of her involvement in these two controversies. So in particular, in both of the controversies, it seems that Reimarus is hesitant to reveal certain information. So in the case of the fragment controversy, she does give the manuscript, her father's manuscript, to Lessing and allows him to publish fragments from it. But she's getting pressure, both from Hennings and from Lessing, to allow for the publication of the full manuscript. And she gets asked repeatedly if she'll allow for that. And she repeatedly says no, right? So there's a sense then in which she's clearly holding back some information, right? Refraining from publication in this regards. In the case of the pantheism controversy, we saw that quote just a minute ago, where she says that her blood was boiling when she got the book from Jacobi. And so she seems obviously quite annoyed and frustrated that Jacobi has chosen to publish the correspondence, and we might think is also frustrated that Jacobi has kind of publicly revealed the nature of Lessing's Spinozism. And so once again, it seems like there's a hesitancy on her part about making certain ideas public or publishing certain information. And one might think that there's a kind of tension then in Reimarus's overall outlook, because as a committed proponent of enlightenment, Reimarus throughout her writings and correspondence is very much in favor of free speech and very much in favor of relaxations on censorship and book publication, and very much in favor of the overcoming of prejudices in favor of rationally justified beliefs. So she claims that if people have prejudices, even like morally beneficial prejudices, like maybe they happen to believe things in an unreflective way, but nevertheless, those beliefs lead them to act morally. She still thinks that all of those prejudices should be replaced with rationally justified beliefs, sort of as soon as such arguments are available, it seems. So then we seem to be in a sort of odd spot, with her on the one hand being very much in favor of free speech and publication. So, why would she be reluctant to allow Jacobi to publish that Lessing had been a follower of Spinoza? Very much in favor of the idea that we should get the information to the people once it's available, rather than holding it back so the people can replace their unreflective prejudices with rationally justified beliefs. And yet she's holding back large parts of her father's manuscript. So you might think that there's a little bit of tension here in her commitment to enlightenment on the one hand, and then the actions that she's taking in these two controversies. And so what I argue in the chapter is I argue against a kind of standard view for explaining her behavior, and then try to put forward an alternative proposal. So the standard view for why Reimarus might seem to betray her Enlightenment ideals in these regards is mainly that she's worried for her family, in particular for her mother's health. So in the context of the fragment controversy, there's indications that there's a concern amongst family members that if they get drawn into this controversy, that it might end up taking a very large toll on their elderly mother. And so maybe they'd rather not get too heavily involved for her sake. And then the other part of the standard view is that Reimarus is really worried in many ways for her own social reputation. So maybe she's mostly annoyed with Jacobi for having in some ways dragged her in to what becomes the pantheism controversy, and worried about how that's going to reflect on her, especially given the social conventions of the time regarding women and women's involvement with philosophy and intellectual discussions, etc. So I don't want to totally dismiss the standard view. I do think that the Reimarus children were concerned about their mother's health. There seems to be good evidence about that, or for that. And we know that Reimarus had some concern for social reputation. It seems to have been behind a lot of her decisions to publish anonymously or just with initials. That seems to be from a concern with social reputation, given the conventions and norms at the time. So I don't think that the standard view is like entirely wrong, but I do think that the standard view is limited and that it misses a really important part of Reimarus's view, and a part that I think shows her less as betraying her Enlightenment ideals in favor of security, and rather as taking a position that's also in line with her view of Enlightenment. So in particular, I argue that Reimarus has firm views about what kind of public discourse is really necessary to advance the Enlightenment search for truth and the Enlightenment attempt to get rid of or overcome prejudices. And in particular, she really thinks that public debate needs to be sort of moderate and reasoned. And as such, she's very antagonistic towards anything that seems like a polemic, or anything that might become more about personalities or particular people, rather than about the issues themselves. And in both the pantheism controversy and the fragment controversy, it seems to me there's a lot of evidence which shows that this is very much what's guiding a lot of her decisions about what to publish, or her feelings regarding Jacobi's own decisions about what to publish. So in the case of the fragment controversy, she's very concerned that revealing more information than has already been revealed isn't going to be especially helpful for advancing the debate, but will lead to increased polemics, which will just lead to sort of partisanship and a lack of real consideration of the issues. And so she's in favor of a more sort of gradual revealing of information that she thinks is going to better sort of maintain the temperature in the room to allow for good public conversation. And then in the case of the pantheism controversy, she worries that Jacobi's decision to publish not simply Lessing's confession of Spinozism, but some of like Lessing's jokes and asides and this and that, is going to make it, Lessing seem just sort of like a blasphemer, which is going to allow for Lessing's critics to really focus on Lessing's personality and the notion of Lessing as a blasphemer, rather than on the sort of actual philosophical and theological issues that are at stake. And she seems to worry it's going to make it easy for people to sort of dismiss Lessing, you know, as like a bad person, rather than to take seriously the issues that are being considered and discussed. So the proposal then that I advance in the chapter is that much of what guides her approach to these issues is this sort of prudential outlook about what does she think is going to be necessary in order to maintain the right kind of discourse and debate for advancing the truth as she sees it. Now, I'll just note in closing that obviously a decision to like hold back information because one thinks that holding back the information is going to allow for a more moderate and reasoned debate is going to be a controversial decision, and different people might have different attitudes towards it. And this was also the case in her own lifetime. So Hennings, her brother-in-law in particular, will say to her things like, you never know when's the right time. Like when Luther, you know, did all his stuff, he didn't know if it was the right time or not. So you should just go ahead and like publish it all now. And she seems to be responding with this sort of prudential sort of maneuver. But it was certainly controversial, even in her own circles at the time. So thank you.
Thanks, Reid. And we will turn it over to the last panelist. Where did she go? There she is.
I'm here.
I'm just looking for you on my list here. Okay, Anne Pollock, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Corey. Thank you for letting me participate in this project. It was a lot of fun. And guys, don't be concerned. So the title is pretty long, and I'm talking about 3 people here. But I'm actually really trying to make it short so that we don't run over time too egregiously. What I'm interested in, and I'm prodding the boundaries here a little bit, is the connection of philosophy and literature. And Stephanie already said that we need to kind of rethink those boundaries in philosophies anyways, because these women make them or transform them or change them anyways. And I'm also expanding the limit here because my women are all born in the second half of the 18th century, and they kind of proceed well into the 19th century. So we have to kind of think in the background of the long 18th century here. So I'm talking about Henriette Herz, Leuven and Bettina von Arnim. My interest in my chapter is the issue of self-formation that these women are facing as public intellectuals because there was no real exemplar for them. So how can you fashion yourself as an intellectual and getting out of this private sphere of the house without this exemplar that you can kind of model your approach on? And I think that these women came up with really interesting strategies. I talk about under 2 headlines, I talk about these strategies. So the first one is the fusion of the public and the private space in the salon. Both Rahel Varnhagen and Henriette Herz were among the first to hold a salon in Germany. They were not the first, but among the first. And in these circles, what was tremendously important was the establishment of an intellectual debate through dialogue. So it was not so much the self-formation or the self-presentation of just one person, but of this one person who fosters an intellectual debate and who is kind of the center of various debates on literature and philosophy. The second strategy is to kind of fictionalize life and to show oneself or a fictional version of oneself in books and letters. And the main character for this one is Bettina von Arnim, about whom I will talk in the second half of my talk. The kind of the tension that you always see, of course, is between the creation of a character, more or less fictional, and the creation of a public persona, and the issue of this public persona being in contact, in dialogue with other people. I think Stephanie already hinted in that direction, that the aesthetics card is here very much at play, that these relations between the self and the other are laden with certain problems, and it's sometimes not that easy to see these people really, because we don't have much of they didn't write extensive philosophical treatises. Some of them wrote some letters, but even there it's really hard to discern what was posing and what was authentic self. And so we are always caught up in this mutual exchange between a private authentic self and a public fictional self, and these selves in dialogue with each others. It's also clear that being self-concerned is rather different and rather hard when it comes to seeking dialogue with others. So if you're self-concerned, then you're concerned with yourself. When you're in dialogue, you ought to be concerned with the other. But I understand the formation of the self as being equally reliant on both of these aspects. So to become oneself, one needs partners in dialogue with whom to test out one's ideas and visions. And to be in proper dialogue, a level of self-awareness, but also of self-concern is indispensable. So we always see this interaction, so to say, between these two. It's also worthwhile asking whether the identification of a specifically female contribution to philosophy or philosophical debates just serve to reinforce a common prejudice, that is, that this aesthetics card becomes kind of the female card, and we talk about these methods of self-formation and these methods of leading a philosophical discourse just as merely female ways of doing so, or does it actually help to turn these female weaknesses into strengths? This development on an individual level, it looks rather self-concerned, because these people were not really that keen on furthering the case of the women in general, but only their cases. So this is this development, as I claim, is complex, imaginative, and overall essentially dialogical. So it's complex in that it involves a plethora of means and methods of self-exploration, of self-expression, and of self-formation. Accordingly, the reconstruction of this development must consider a variety of genres, such as letters, diaries, biographies, and travel journals. Here, Varnhagen and Brentano von Arnim show quite clearly that the establishment of a new persona involves vastly different literary and social techniques. It's also imaginative, that kind of goes together with the first part, in that the projected personae contain strong fictional elements, which depend upon constant reformulation in response to the respective recipients of these projections. So I will show that, or in the chapter, I will show that that Varnhagen, for example, is a character that we see in these letter exchange, and she sort of develops in these letters, and you have to look for quite a complex persona that changes in respect to the people that she is talking to. Lastly, this development is dialogical. First, in that it depends on the interaction of the aforementioned different literary, artistic, and social forms. And second, more obvious, this kind of identity is essentially formed, acknowledged, and thus realized through intersubjective exchange. All female intellectuals invest a considerable amount of energy into establishing and securing an active exchange with others. Instead of wondering why these women did not reassert themselves, we might rather ask which new avenues of self-formation, but also of inquiry, their respective strategies open up. This dialogical mode still awaits its full recognition. Corey, you were talking about the last 20 years that this kind of came back into the focus of philosophical research, and I would agree to that. So we still have to think about what a new philosophical canon and what the new philosophical genres are supposed to be. And with my paper, I just hope to help breaking this pattern of interpretation, which may come with the widening of the scope of what counts as philosophically or intellectually relevant. So just very quickly, First, the salon. Both Henriette Herz and Ralph Varnhagen are among the first to establish such a salon in Germany. And the salon allowed women to fulfill roles that were new to them. So they could stay being the mother and being kind of the fostering type of person, but now she was also the center, the nurturer, the performer, and the discusser. It's not the case, actually, that in all of these salons, women played the most important role. And even in the case of Henriette Herz and Ralph Varnhagen, it was not the case that they were talking all the time, like I'm doing right now. It was more that they were there to foster an exchange between these people. And they really attracted a lot of famous literary and philosophical figures. It was deemed to be important to be seen at these salons and to talk at these salons in order to be someone, in particular to be someone in the city of Berlin. And you all know that if you are somebody in the city of Berlin, then you are somebody. Okay. For Henriette Herz, what is worth noting here is also her friendship with Schleiermacher. Both of them insisted that this friendship was really platonic. And we have a lot of letters from Schleiermacher where he says, that he had to laugh so hard because people kept thinking that he was in love with her. They were actually really talking to each other and were exchanging ideas. And we can say that his Versuch einer Theorie des geselligen Betragens, it's towards a theory of social conduct from 1799, is an attempt to capture the essence of the salon. And the one important thing that the salon did, and that was a remerging of the public and the private sphere in order to promote the improvement of the human being. The interesting thing that Varnhagen did was that she established an artwork that need the reader and that need a constant reformulation and a constant discovery of this character that she was. She lived and she suffered in her correspondences, and these correspondences she kept, and she and her husband put them together in a book. And this book is to this day a really fascinating piece of a really fascinating witness of what was going on in the second half of the 18th century. But it also showed how hard it was for a Jew to find her standing in the social circles of her time. In view of time, I will stop it at that and just quickly move over to Bettina von Arnim, my secret love. She lived from 1785 to 1859. So she's really, her life was in between the two revolutions that shaped the last part of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. And she herself is kind of a really interesting revolutionary. It was hard for other people to depict her. Whenever we see eyewitnesses, we read the accounts of eyewitnesses of her, they were really unsure what to make of her. She didn't really look very much like a female. She was really small. She never sat on the chair, but she always sat on the back part or on the table or somewhere else. She ran around, she sang. She did all kinds of things that nobody was supposed to be doing, but she did them anyways. And she lived through this breaking of barriers. So in a way, she was really different to Eliza Reimarus in that she didn't care at all about these things. In the paper, I concentrated mostly on her first book, which she wrote after her husband died. So before of that, she had 8 children, I think. And she limited herself to the role. She had it so long before, but then she limited herself to the role of the mother. Even there, she was really innovative and unconventional. But after her husband died, like 3 years after, she published this book on Goethe's correspondence with a child. It made her instantly famous, and she became really, really important, not only for the literary scene, but also for the philosophical and political scene. And what we see there is that she used the concept of love for reassertion. So you can read the whole thing as this little woman, or this child, as she calls herself, that just follows Goethe around and drowns him in words. But what she's doing kind of in the background without us really noticing is that she establishes herself as a really powerful and multifaceted persona, because she takes over the dialogue and she kind of shapes Goethe according to her image and not the other way around. And it's not by chance that Goethe became quite afraid of her. So what I think she actually achieved there was, on the one hand, that she break through the stereotypical feminine ideas of femininity and established a new picture of feminine power. And also she artfully crafted her own personality as a decisively public personality who also wanted to exert political power, as she did in her later books, about whom I didn't talk in my paper and I will not talk here. So all in all, I do not claim that blurring the lines between public and private as undertaken by these intellectuals exhausts the possible strategies of female self-formation, nor that these models were immediately taken up or utterly successful. The forces of restoration in late 19th century Germany were way too strong for that. But still, what remained from these intellectuals is that they helped later generations of female writers to find their own voice in their struggle for recognition. My argument in the very end is hermeneutical. What matters is that these women sketched the outline of a new role, performatively reforming common practices of sociability and dialogue to achieve their aim. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Well, what's become clear from all of this, I think, at least one thing that's become clear is I'm a better editor than I am a chair. I've turned it over to Stephen now to take over for the Q&A. So Stephen, you have 10 minutes.
Great. Well, I think we will extend the time a little bit. I think also as planned, perhaps so that people can stretch their legs a little, we'll take a quick 3-minute break. So while we do so, you can reflect on your question and you can use the raise hand function, which is via the reactions button, to already indicate that you have a question. So please do that. Let's take 3 minutes and we'll start back again at 6:52. Should we start again? Great. So we have a first question from Jason Hanover.
Thanks, and hello. And first of all, congratulations to everyone for this amazing project. It's a super exciting accomplishment, and I'm really looking forward to reading these papers. I wish that would have had access to all of them already. It's so helpful, and specifically for some project that I've been working on, some work that I've been pursuing on women philosophers, primarily in the 19th century. And the legacy of Spinozism. And so my two questions relate to that, come from that personal interest. And the first one is for Reid, if I may. And I'm just wondering quite simply whether there's evidence that Eliza Reimarus reads Spinoza. She's arguing that Christianity can't boast of philosophical truth. She's a proponent of the free press. She subscribes, it seems, to Spinoza's motto, Caute, and she's obviously involved then in the Spinoza controversy itself. So is she also reading Spinoza? Is she engaging with Spinoza's thought on that level, or from this kind of distance? And then the second question is for Stephanie. Hello, Stephanie. And I really enjoyed your reflections on the boundaries of philosophy. I'm convinced that in order to do justice to a wide range of women philosophers, the history of philosophy really has to expand its conception of what kind of texts can have philosophical value, where arguments can lie, and so on. And I'm interested, though, and wanted to put pressure on this argument that I guess Unzer makes, according to which the mathematical mode of presentation is fit really just for a solitary kind of philosophical pursuit. In Spinoza's case, I think it's crucial for the kind of circle that he's built and for the kind of exchange that they're pursuing, so that they can reference in the circle various propositions and pursue a dialogue on these bases. Carolina Michaelis-Bäumer-Schlegel Schelling also seems to think that there can be something interesting here, even as she's pursuing a project that doesn't have that mathematical mode, but it looks more like a correspondence. And she says once in a letter that Spinoza has much more poesy than Fichte, criticizing Fichte and siding with Schelling, who's also pursuing this kind of mathematical mode of presentation in the Darstellung that she reads with him line by line, apparently. And so this also returns a little bit to some things that Anne was saying about dialogue. And I'm just wondering how the mathematical mode of presentation, the geometrical mode of presentation then in Spinoza, but also as it appears in later form in Leibniz and Wolff and so on, systematic mode of presentation fares and what that has to do with dialogue and what Unzer is really interested in there.
Okay, thank you. So I think the first question was targeted at Reid.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Unfortunately, the answer is not clear. So there's no passages that I have found where it's obvious that she's like directly engaging with the text of the Ethics or the text of the theological political treatise. Her brother does write a number of sort of refutations of Spinoza that she is forwarding on to Mendelssohn. And, you know, certainly she's reading the brother's arguments and the refutations of Spinoza from the brother, but whether she herself is reading Spinoza directly, there doesn't seem to be a clear record in that regard. You know, you might see a lot of affinities between aspects of her father's project in the Schutzschrift and the theological political treatise. But again, in the case of Reimarus herself, there's not, at least that I found, a clear historical record. She is, however, definitely reading various Spinozist texts. So, for example, she writes a letter to Jacobi regarding a book by Dietz, which is providing a kind of interpretation of Spinoza, although we today might find it a kind of odd interpretation. He interprets Spinoza as sort of having a world soul sort of theory. So she's definitely reading those types of texts and commenting on those texts, but I don't have a definite answer as to whether she has read the original Spinoza texts themselves or not.
Okay, thank you. And then
If I could actually just interject quickly, just to draw your attention, Jason, to a recently published journal issue by Sabrina Ebbesmeyer. I believe the title is something like "Where Are All the Radical Women?" So insofar as your question is not just about Reimarus specifically, but about the role of radical philosophical thinking and its uptake by women in the 18th century, this special issue in Intellectual History Review does take up some of these questions.
Great. And Stephanie.
Yes, so Jason, nice to see you. Thanks for your question. I think actually the mathematical model of philosophy that Unzer is criticizing is not, I mean, what she criticizes is not that that mathematics would not be dialogical. She, in a way, I think she bases her criticism of mathematics on, I mean, I think that there's in Wolff himself, you have really a very particular reading of mathematics. Mathematics is no longer the model for philosophical reasoning as it has been in Descartes, for example, and where Wolff kind of shifts the attention to ontology and metaphysics as providing common notions and some kind of directive notions to the human mind, and acquire some methodological value itself. So actually, in a way, mathematics here already becomes less important as a methodological model in Wolff, and Unzer takes over this idea, and the idea that we all reason, we all have empirical notions and reason from them on. So the criticism of philosophy as not being or her new notion of philosophy as being an art of speech is kind of independent. It's not directly related. It's more related to the idea of also Wolffian idea of philosophy as a practical, universal practical philosophy, and the philosopher being a teacher of humanity. But I think it's not very directly linked here, although there may be interesting thoughts on this link in other philosophers.
Thanks so much, Reid, Stephanie, and Corey. That's extremely helpful.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Gabe Gottlieb.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everyone, for this. Should say I should be grading papers, and I was deliberating what should I do? Should I grade? Should I come to this? And I'm very glad that I did come to this, because this was a really interesting session, and I really look forward to checking out the book. So my question is for Corey. I was really interested in this topic. I'm wondering what other kinds of prejudices or critiques of prejudices are coming up in the rigorous investigations. And I'm also wondering, I saw that there's an essay on Theodor Gottlieb von Hippel in the book, who addresses similar issues in his work on improving the civil status of women. I can't remember the exact title, something like that, if you translate it. So I'm wondering kind of what influence her work had, because these debates continue to unfold throughout the 18th century. So I guess one question is really about what other kinds of critiques of prejudices are coming up in her work, and how do you understand the influence of the book on philosophers, maybe figures like Hippel?
Thanks, Gabe. So in terms of other discussions of prejudice, I don't know there's much, but I think one thing that helps to kind of flesh out Erxleben's project a little bit is to consider some of the kind of practical reforms that she suggests. So she's actually an advocate for co-education of men and women. And this part of this is actually due to, I think, the influence of her father, who was an educational theorist. He was actually educated in Franke's orphanage in Halle, and he had some fairly radical ideas. He wrote a dissertation on how you can have a university in every city and why you should. But so Erxleben is developing and kind of expanding some of his more radical views. So I think that it doesn't kind of extend the view of prejudice, but it shows that in addition to this kind of narrow criticism of certain prejudices, she has some practical proposals for how education can be reformed to support and nurture women in education. And so in terms of the broader influence of Erxleben's text, the answer is it regrettably little. So I kind of teased this at the end of my presentation, but there's an interesting one of Eliza Reimarus's probably one of her friends is Amalia Holst, who was an educational theorist. She's a pedagogue, and she actually an educator, eine praktische Erzieherin, who lived in Hamburg. And she wrote a book that was published in 1802 called Die Bestimmung des Weibes. So kind of echoing Fichte. So, but of course she's echoing Spalding. But in this book, she's talking about Erxleben, and she refers to Erxleben's son. Her children ended up being very prominent professors, and one of her sons was an important biologist in Göttingen. Anyway, so Holst says that she was talking to him, and he mentioned this text by his mother on prejudice and women's education, which is what Holst was doing in her book. But Holst says that I just can't find the book. And so this is just 50 years later, really. And in fact, the immediate aftermath is that Erxleben, her book was actually pirated and published so that it was given a title. So it looked like one of Wolff's texts on the Vernünftige Gedanken über whatever. It had a kind of Wolffian title and was positively reviewed. But in terms of its kind of immediate effect or even kind of 50 years hence, it wasn't well known. And indeed, I mean, yeah, so that's kind of a regrettable story about when you work in, you know, history of feminism, history of women's philosophy, is you find these kind of same arguments over and over again because the first ones are neglected, they aren't taken up with any kind of seriousness. And in terms of Hippel, I mean, I think what connects Erxleben with Hippel, not probably directly, but is a concern for practical reform, right? So that's Hippel's big thing as well. Is that it's what I mean. He kind of so Charlotte Saboin is the one who contributes the Hippel essay in the volume, and she focuses really on kind of the importance of not just Hippel's kind of criticism of the theoretical foundations or the theoretical reasons for why we might deny women access to education. Or deny them status of citizens, but how we can also reform the institutions. And so I think that there's actually commonality between Erxleben and Hippel there when one focuses on her more practical recommendations for reform.
Great. Thank you both. The next question is from Karen de Boer.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a more general question maybe to everyone, because yes, I wanted to ask what we actually mean when we refer to contributions to the history of philosophy. Because for me, to be honest, it's not very clear what these women or female philosophers or female intellectuals actually contributed to what we call the history of philosophy. And it seems to me that we have more focused on a few women from intellectual families who had more opportunities to be educated than most others, and who were able to get rid of some of the prejudices and conditions that hampered the development of women more generally. So they could take steps, but I think we mostly see that they had a potential that could not be fully realized given the conditions. So I think this is one of the things that we've been discussing, and that emerges from the presentations. Whereas what to me is less clear is what, as I already mentioned, to what extent can their reflections and letters and books and so on count as contributions to the history of philosophy. And of course, I realize that that it's complicated to determine what is and what isn't the history of philosophy, given the fact that has also been pointed out that the criteria as to what it means to do philosophy and to contribute to the history of philosophy are partly, or maybe largely, defined by a male-dominated discourse. But I don't think we can, completely put the criteria on this fact of male-dominated discussions. And that maybe there's also something like a history of philosophy that advances because of real innovations at a certain level, and that I think is very different from taking up a certain position, relying on certain ideas of Thomasius, or relying on certain Spinozistic ideas, etc., or advancing certain views that have already been advanced by others. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share, and I realizing that it's a difficult issue because the criteria by means of which we judge what counts as a contribution to the history of philosophy are not neutral. So I don't know who wants to respond to this, but I thought.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think it's very interesting, which many people I think will probably have a response to. But I suppose I would like to come to Anne and Christian, who haven't answered the question yet. But Stephanie has sent me a message to ask if she could reply. So I'll come to Stephanie first.
So just one element of a response, a difficult question. I think, I mean, if the history of philosophy is something that has been written once for all and it has already been written, then there is no place for these women philosophers. But if it's a question, if the history of philosophy is something that we are rewriting and writing again, then maybe there could be a place if the women philosophers have good arguments. And I think what we try to show is that they had some arguments in a debate, which of course was a collective debate. So I mean, my Unzer, she's a Wolfian in a sense, but that again, I mean, it's a certain model of philosophy as being the lonely thinker thing, where only Spinoza and Thomasius and Wolf are philosophers. If you have a more collective idea of philosophy, I think there can be a place. I mean, if they have arguments, which we tried to show. So that was just a quick reaction. I'm sure there are more things to say.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to?
Yeah. So one thing is, I would start with Stephanie and would say, well, they offer a pretty good way of criticizing older attempts of writing the history of philosophy. There's this book. I think the title is Women of Letters. No, that's not the title. Sorry. It's by Ruth Whittle. That's what I remember. And she looks at histories of philosophy and histories of literature of the late 19th century, and she shows how wrong-headed the judgments are that some of these historians make concerning these women in the light in which they present them, and that they have no chance of making an argument because they are per se just reformulating what somebody else has already said. And so I think it shows how deeply problematic most of the histories of philosophies are that we are still reliant on, and maybe this volume can help to kind of change this. The second thing that I wanted to say, that doesn't really not pertain so much the 18th century, but really much more the 19th century. There is this wonderful article on feminism by Jane Kneller in the Oxford Handbook on 19th Century Philosophy, in which she argues that certain aspects of romantic philosophizing lend themselves to this distorting reading of the history of philosophy, and that is the issue of symphilosophizing, because we have this tendency to still search for the one author of a certain thing, and then if we find this author and this author is male, then everything is already done for. And maybe these women, and in particular those that I was talking about, but also Caroline Schlegel-Schelling and others, they did sympphilosophize with their husbands and with their friends. And what we read about right now is just what Schleiermacher said and what Friedrich Schlegel said and August Wilhelm Schlegel said and all these people said. But actually, quite some of their translations, for example, are not theirs. The translations of the women. And this can count for other issues as well. So I think what is needed is a more nuanced view on who is behind the symphilosophizing in these cases in the romantic circles, and there the judgment is certainly not just. So on the other hand, of course, we have to say in my case, I think Bettina von Arnim is really original, but she's more original in the literary sphere than in the philosophical sphere. She hates philosophy. But in the other cases, I would rather think that we need to kind of rethink the way in which we think about these models of thinking.
Great, thank you very much.
Can I get in there too, actually? Unless Christiane, I wanted to give him a chance to reply if he wanted to.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to Karen's question, but more a reflection. And I think that we need in history of philosophy to revise our notion of relevance. And because for a very long time, independently of the question of women and male philosophers, we ask ourselves why we should work on such or such philosopher or doctrine, because it was relevant, because it was influential, and so on. And I think this is problematic in our understanding of some context. And I would also add another element in relation to Sophie. I was also asking myself while working on these texts, not only what is a philosopher, but what is a philosophical text? Was it a proper contribution? Because in her case, we're talking about very short fragments, very short passages in longer letters in which she talks about political questions, and then she turns to rapidly to a philosophical question. She reacts. She said, "I do not agree. I think you should understand this or that notion in this sense." Then comes back to, well, political problems. And so, is this really a philosophical text? I think so, but at the same time, I was kind of feeling uncomfortable about what is this text I'm dealing with? What is the status? What is the nature of this text? I just decided to say this is a philosophical contribution, but I'm not sure that anyone would agree that this is at the same level as, I don't know, other well-known contributions. So yeah.
I just wanted to echo a lot of what was already said, but I also want to, I think, say something else. I think it's a really good question. In fact, I'm sure it's going to be a version of this is going to come up in some of the reviews of this volume when they're published. But I think, I mean, kind of a charitable way, I think there's a kind of a challenging way of putting this question, which is like, I read through this book, I didn't find one new Leibniz, one new Kant, one new Fichte, etc. Right? So why should we bother talking about these figures? That's I think a less charitable way of putting the question. But a more charitable way relates to some of the comments that I made at the beginning of this session, where, well, part of the reasons why you don't find these women mentioned in histories of German philosophy is because history is kind of doing its best, right, to bear a silent witness to what, you know, the fact that women are in these challenging times are put under enormous pressures, face enormous obstacles, and that what they produce is not going to be up, even though they have the kind of the potential to do so, it's not going to be up to the standards of what we recognize as real serious philosophy in the period, right? And so what could historians do if they didn't want to, you know, embarrass or cast in negative light the women that are involved in philosophy in this period? What else could they do but just pass them by in silence? And I think that the way to respond to that is something along the lines of what Stephanie was saying too. And is that, well, I mean, if you think that philosophy is something that happens in universities, that only occurs when we're exchanging treatises that are titled Versuch einer neuen transzendentalen Philosophie amongst professors, well then, yeah, then you're not going to see much of value in this. But you think of philosophy as something that humans do, that insofar as you have reason, that you're going to be interested in it. You're going to wonder why things are. You're going to ask the kind of questions that other philosophers are asking too, albeit in a hopelessly abstract way in some cases. But then that's going to lead you to look at different figures, that there's different ways in which this philosophical interest expresses itself. And the cataloging of those and engaging with those, seeing how women found ways in spite of those obstacles to interact, to engage with the contemporary intellectual culture, is a kind of a fascinating study of the human impulse to philosophy. So I think that what Christian said is correct too, and what Anne said is correct too, that there's a kind of different way of doing the history here, but ultimately the justification is not that it's, I mean, I think that what we really have to ask, the kind of question we have to ask is, well, is philosophy something that only happens in the academic context, right? It doesn't seem like it ought to be, because philosophy is, what drives us to engage in philosophical speculation is more than that. And so the study of the different ways in which it expresses itself, I think is valuable as well.
Great, thank you. This strikes me as a good point to bring the formal part of the meeting to a close. So I think what we will do is what we will normally do is to continue the discussions a little more informally in a moment. But first, I just thank all 5 of our speakers for these really insightful thoughts and what looks like a fascinating volume.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody, and thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks again. So